Out here, the rules are simple. Only the strongest survive. But what happens when even the mightiest creatures fall victim to circumstances beyond their control? What happens when a wild bear, a ruler of the forest, finds itself powerless, staring at the edge of an abyss with no way out? This is a story of desperation, courage, and an unbreakable will to live. The air is thick with tension. The wind howls through the trees, carrying the scent of danger. Every second counts. The bear is stranded, its massive body trembling, eyes filled with terror. It knows something is wrong. It knows it shouldn't be here, but it has no choice, and neither do we. The rescue team is already on edge. They've seen animals in distress before, but this is different. The terrain is brutal, steep cliffs, unstable ground, and the ever-present threat of predators lurking in the shadows. One wrong move could spell disaster. And yet, despite the overwhelming odds, despite the danger, there is no turning back. This isn't just about saving an animal. This is about hope. It's about proving that even in the harshest conditions, compassion can triumph over cruelty, and that sometimes the most fearsome creatures are the ones who need us the most. But time is running out. The bear's strength is fading. The storm is approaching, and the most critical moment of this mission is about to begin. The tension in the air is almost unbearable. The bear, once a symbol of dominance and power, now clings to life with every ounce of strength it has left. Its massive paws slip against the unforgiving terrain, eyes darting in panic, searching, hoping for a way out. But there is none, not without help. And that's when it happens. A deep guttural sound escapes its throat. Not a roar of anger, not a growl of warning, but something else entirely. A plea, a desperate instinctive call for survival. It doesn't know who's watching, doesn't know if help will come, but in that moment it does something incredible. It trusts. And that trust changes everything. Imagine being there, standing at the edge of that moment. What would you do? Could you keep your hands steady? Could you silence the pounding in your chest long enough to make the right move? It's easy to think about it from a distance, but when you're face to face with something this raw, this real, there's no time for hesitation. The difference between life and death is measured in split seconds, and just like that, the decision is made. The team springs into action, moving carefully but quickly, knowing that each step brings them closer to either triumph or tragedy. The ropes are secured, the tension is palpable, and then the moment of truth arrives. The ropes tighten, the wind howls through the jagged cliffs, and every muscle in the rescue team is straining under the pressure of the moment. The bear, still teetering on the edge of disaster, lets out another deep guttural breath, a sound that cuts through the roaring storm like a silent scream. It's no longer just an animal in danger. It's a living, breathing force of nature, hanging in the balance between survival and the abyss below. The sky above darkens, the clouds rolling in like silent spectators to this battle of life and death. Every movement, every second, every heartbeat matters now. The rescuers move in unison, communicating with mere glances, their voices barely audible over the chaos surrounding them. The ropes must hold. The bear must not panic. But how do you tell a wild animal that it needs to trust you? How do you convince a creature built for solitude and survival that in this moment it must surrender to human hands? There's no answer, only instinct, only action. And in that action, a delicate and dangerous dance begins. The bear shifts its weight, muscles rippling beneath its soaked fur, its breaths heavy and labored. It doesn't understand what's happening, only that something unfamiliar is tightening around it. Panic flares in its eyes. A split second of hesitation from the team, and this entire operation could fall apart. The ground beneath the bear crumbles slightly, sending loose dirt and stones tumbling down into the void below. The sheer drop seems endless, the kind of fall that erases all hope. But this bear has been fighting since the moment it realized it was trapped. It has held on, clawed against the inevitable, refused to accept defeat. And now, as the ropes secure its massive body, it has one final decision to make. Fight the rescuers and risk slipping further, or, against all instinct, submit to the unknown. It snarls, a deep rumbling sound that vibrates through the air like a thunderclap. But there's something different now. It's not a sound of pure aggression. It's something closer to fear, something closer to surrender. And the team knows this is their chance. One rescuer inches forward, slow, steady, extending a gloved hand as if offering a silent truce. No sudden movements, no mistakes. Every breath is measured. The bear's eyes flicker, its massive head lowering just slightly, as if testing the intent behind the gesture. The rain pelts against its thick fur, water dripping from its muzzle. Then, something incredible happens. Its breathing slows, stops thrashing. And for the first time since this rescue began, there is a flicker of control. Not over the storm, not over the perilous cliffside, but over the moment itself. The team doesn't hesitate. The harness is secured, the ropes tighten. The bear flinches, a final protest against captivity. But the moment passes as quickly as it came. This is it. The pull begins. The strength of human hands meets the sheer power of a wild beast, and for a moment, it feels impossible. The weight is immense, the terrain unforgiving. But giving up is not an option. Inch by inch, the bear is lifted. The wind pushes back, the storm resists. Nature fights against intervention. But the determination of those trying to save this animal is unwavering. The rain turns to mist around them, the air thick with the smell of earth and desperation. Mud slips beneath their boots, but they do not falter. The bear's claws dig into the shifting ground, its muscles tense with the effort, and then something shifts. A final tug, a moment frozen in time, and suddenly, the weight they had been battling against for what felt like an eternity is no longer pulling them downward. The bear is free, but it does not run. It does not attack. It stands there, silent, heaving with exhaustion, its chest rising and falling in heavy, labored breaths. The rescuers remain motionless, watching, waiting. What happens now? In all their preparation, all their training, they had focused on the rescue itself, never the moment after. The bear turns its head, eyes locking onto the one rescuer who had extended that first, fragile bridge of trust. A stare that lingers, unreadable, powerful. A moment shared between species, an unspoken acknowledgement of something greater than instinct, greater than survival. And then, as if the storm had never existed, as if the danger had never been real, the bear takes a step forward, then another, until it disappears into the dense shadows of the forest, leaving behind only the memory of its struggle and the people who refused to let it fall. But the story is far from over, because what happens next is even more unbelievable. The wind sweeps through the old cemetery, carrying whispers of something unseen, something unspoken. The air is thick with damp earth and the distant echo of crows circling overhead. It's a place of silence, a place of endings. And yet, in the middle of it all, life clings stubbornly to the cold ground. A small figure, barely moving, a pair of eyes watching, waiting. The puppy, fragile yet determined, is curled near a worn gravestone, his fur damp from the morning mist, his tiny body trembling from more than just the cold. He isn't lost. He isn't wandering aimlessly. He knows exactly where he is, and no one can make him leave. The rescue team moves carefully, their voices low, their steps measured. They've seen strays before, abandoned dogs left to fend for themselves. But this is different. Every time they inch closer, the puppy lifts his head, his eyes filled with something no stray should know: grief. When one of the rescuers kneels, stretching out a gentle hand, he hesitates for a moment, his nose twitching as he takes in the unfamiliar scent. But just as quickly, he scrambles backward, pressing himself against the stone as if drawing strength from something, or someone, who is no longer there. They try everything: food, soft calls, even letting him approach on his own terms. Nothing works. No matter what they do, no matter how gentle they are, he won't leave. The world around him no longer exists. His paws are planted, his heart set. He has chosen his place. And then, the breakthrough. A local woman wrapped in a thick shawl approaches from the narrow path that winds through the graves. Her face is lined with time, her eyes heavy with understanding. She has seen the puppy here before, every morning, every night, always in the same spot, always waiting, and she knows why. Her voice is soft, carrying the weight of a truth that makes the cold seep deeper into their bones. The grave isn't just another marker in the endless rows of stone. It belonged to a woman who had passed away only weeks ago, and she hadn't been alone. She had a companion, a small, devoted shadow that followed her wherever she went. A puppy she had taken in when no one else would. And when she was gone, he had come back, searching, waiting, refusing to believe she wasn't coming home. The rescuers exchange glances, the weight of the revelation settling between them. This isn't just a stray dog. This isn't just a rescue. This is love, raw and unbreakable, stretching beyond the limits of life itself. He isn't lost. He's grieving. The knowledge makes every movement feel heavier, every choice more delicate. How do you take a creature away from the only place he believes she might return? How do you tell him that waiting won't bring her back? They decide to change their approach. No more coaxing, no more attempts to lure him away. Instead, they sit, they wait. Let him see that they aren't here to take him from something, only to bring him to something else. The hours stretch, the day fading into the muted gold of evening. And slowly, ever so slowly, the puppy inches forward. Not toward food, not toward warmth, but toward something he no longer has: connection. The first touch is tentative, a hesitant brush of fur against skin. A test, a question, and when nothing bad happens, when the warmth of human hands doesn't take something from him but offers something instead, he stays. His small body shivers, not from fear, not from cold, but from the overwhelming shift in his world. They don't rush him, they don't force him, they let him decide. Because love, true love, cannot be taken. It can only be given, and in that moment he gives them his trust. Just a little, just enough. As night falls and the last traces of sunlight fade behind the trees, the decision is made. They will not leave him here. But they will not take him by force. He will come willingly when he is ready. And when the stars blink to life above the cemetery, reflecting in the quiet pools of his eyes, he takes his first step toward something new. He is no longer just a puppy in a graveyard. He is Vlad, and his story is only beginning. But this isn't the end of the struggle, not even close. Because what happens next will leave everyone speechless. Before we continue, I want to hear from you. What do you think Vlad was feeling in that moment? If you had been there, what would you have done? Let me know in the comments below. Just type loyalty if this story is already touching your heart. Now let's move on, because what happens next is something no one expected. The night settles over the cemetery, wrapping the gravestones in an eerie silence, broken only by the occasional rustling of wind through the trees. The rescue team remains still, watching, waiting, letting the gravity of the situation sink in. This isn't just another abandoned dog, another stray left to fend for itself. This is something deeper, something heartbreakingly human. Vlad isn't lost. He's mourning. His tiny body shivers as he curls up against the cold stone, pressing himself into the earth, as if he could somehow will her back to him. A voice breaks the silence. One of the older neighbors, a woman wrapped in layers of thick wool, steps forward, her eyes heavy with the weight of knowledge she's carried for weeks. She has seen him here, every day, every night, refusing to move, refusing to let go. She speaks softly, her words carrying more than just facts. They carry the raw ache of understanding. The woman buried here wasn't just a kind stranger to Vlad. She was his home. She had found him on the outskirts of the village, a tiny thing, barely more than bones and fur, surviving on scraps, his ribs protruding, his eyes dull with hunger. But she saw something in him, something worth saving. Every morning, she would set aside a piece of her own modest meal, calling out to him in that gentle way only she knew. At first, he stayed at a distance, watching, waiting, distrustful of human hands. But hunger is relentless, and kindness, true, patient kindness, is irresistible. Day after day, she fed him. But it wasn't just food she offered. It was warmth, safety, belonging. She spoke to him like one speaks to an old friend, telling him about her day, about the aches in her bones, about the memories that lingered in her mind like autumn leaves refusing to fall. And little by little, he came closer. First, just to eat. Then, to sit beside her feet as she rested on her porch. Then, to follow her as she made her way through the village, his tiny paws padding after her slow, careful steps. He became a fixture in her life, her silent companion, her shadow. And then, just as suddenly as she had entered his world, she was gone. One day, she didn't come outside. The chair where she sat remained empty. The door never opened. He waited. Morning turned to afternoon, afternoon to night, night to another day, but she never called his name again. The neighbors had assumed he would leave, that without food, without care, he would wander off, disappear like so many other forgotten strays. But they were wrong. Instead, he followed. He followed her scent, followed the only path that made sense until he arrived at the cemetery, where he found her name carved into stone. And that's where he stayed. The weight of the story settles over the team like a heavy fog. Suddenly, every refusal to leave, every time he ran back to that grave, every time he curled up against the cold marble, it all makes sense. He wasn't just waiting for her. He was refusing to leave her behind. The realization is overwhelming. It's one thing to rescue an animal in danger, to step in when they're starving, injured, lost. But how do you save someone who doesn't want to be saved? How do you convince a heart that refuses to move on that there is something worth living for beyond grief? One of the rescuers, a woman with a voice as soft as the wind through the trees, kneels speaking to him in a hushed tone, not as if she's trying to lure him away, but as if she's speaking to something fragile, something sacred. She tells him he doesn't have to be alone, that there are hands willing to hold him, a place where warmth still exists, that love, real, lasting love, doesn't die. It carries on, in different forms, in new beginnings. But Vlad doesn't move. His eyes, those dark, endless pools, stay fixed on the grave as if expecting her to emerge at any moment, to call his name like she used to. The team is patient, but the night is growing colder, and they know they can't leave him here. Not forever. A decision is made. They will come back again and again as many times as it takes, until he understands that leaving does not mean forgetting, that moving forward does not mean losing what once was. But this is only the beginning, because what happens next will change everything. Before we go on, I need to hear from you. If you were standing there, seeing Vlad's loyalty with your own eyes, what would you have done? Would you have waited, given him space, or tried to carry him away? Comment below with the word devotion if this story is already touching your heart. Now, hold on tight, because what happens next will leave you speechless. The cold night air settled over the cemetery like a heavy shroud, the mist curling around the gravestones, swallowing the rescue team in an eerie silence. The distant sound of owls calling to one another echoed through the trees, but nothing could distract from the sight before them. Vlad remained curled up against the stone, his small body tense, his eyes flickering with an emotion so raw, it was almost painful to witness. He wasn't just resisting, he was refusing to leave, refusing to let go, refusing to accept that the only person who had ever loved him was truly gone. The team had tried everything. Soft voices, extended hands, food placed just within reach. None of it mattered. Every time they inched closer, he pulled back. When they thought they had gained his trust, he would retreat, pressing himself into the cold ground, his tiny form trembling but unmoving. It wasn't fear of people, it wasn't stubbornness. It was something deeper. He wasn't lost, he had chosen to be here. One of the rescuers exhaled sharply, stepping back to regroup. They had encountered fearful animals before, ones that had been abused, mistreated, left to fend for themselves. But this was different. This wasn't the kind of fear that came from trauma or pain. This was love so deep that it had turned into grief, into an anchor that bound Vlad to this place. They whispered among themselves, trying to find a solution. They couldn't force him. That would break the fragile trust they had begun to build. They needed a way to show him that leaving wouldn't mean forgetting, that moving forward wouldn't erase the past. And then, an idea. One of the older women in the village, the same one who had told them Vlad's story, stepped forward, cradling something in her hands. A scarf, worn, faded, carrying the scent of the woman Vlad had loved so deeply. She had found it in the woman's small home, untouched, folded neatly on a chair as if waiting to be used one last time. Slowly, gently, they placed the scarf near the entrance of a carrier, the fabric soft against the ground. It was a gamble. If he rejected it, if he ignored it, they would be out of options. But if he recognized it, if he understood, maybe, just maybe, it would be enough. The team stepped back, giving him space, barely daring to breathe as they watched. At first, he didn't move. His ears twitched, his nose flared, but he remained pressed against the gravestone, unwilling to break the tether that kept him there. Then, ever so slowly, his head lifted. His nose twitched again, catching something in the air. His body tensed, his eyes narrowing as he focused on the small piece of fabric lying in front of him. A second passed, then another, and then he moved. It was small at first, barely a shift in weight, but it was enough. His tiny paws pushed against the damp earth as he took a hesitant step forward, then another. His movements were slow, cautious, like he wasn't sure if he was allowed to go any closer. His nose lowered, touching the scarf, breathing in the scent that had once meant safety, warmth, home. A sound barely audible escaped him. A whimper. A quiet, aching noise that spoke louder than words ever could. His body trembled, his small chest rising and falling with shaky breaths. And then, without warning, he curled around the fabric, pressing his face into it, his tail tucked tight against his body. The team held their breath, watching, waiting. He stayed like that for what felt like forever, clutching the only piece of her that remained. And in that moment, something shifted. He didn't run, he didn't hide, he had made a choice. One of the rescuers, moving as slowly as humanly possible, inched forward, lowering to his level. No sudden movements, no reaching hands, just presence, just understanding. Vlad's ears twitched, but he didn't move away. His eyes, still full of something unspoken, lifted to meet theirs. And for the first time since this all began, he didn't pull back. The team knew better than to rush. This was his moment, his choice. If they forced him, if they tried to take control now, everything would be undone. So they waited. Let him decide. Let him feel. Let him grieve. And then he took a step forward. A small, hesitant step, but a step nonetheless. The scarf remained clenched between his tiny teeth as he crossed the invisible boundary between the past and the future, between what was and what could be. He didn't know where he was going, didn't know what waited for him beyond this place, but he was willing to take that step. The team moved slowly, opening the carrier without a sound, giving him the space to make the decision on his own. He hesitated, looking back one last time. His gaze lingered on the gravestone, on the name etched into the cold stone, on the place he had called home for so long. And then, with one final breath, he stepped inside. The door was closed, but gently. No sudden snap, no fear, just a quiet, careful motion. He didn't fight it. He simply curled up, pressing the scarf against his face, his small body still trembling but no longer resisting. The rescuers didn't cheer. They didn't celebrate. This wasn't victory. This wasn't success. This was something far more delicate. This was trust, and trust once given must never be broken. The night air remained thick with silence as the carrier was lifted, carried away from the cemetery, away from the gravestone, away from the place Vlad had anchored himself for so long. But as they walked, As the wind carried away the last remnants of the evening, one thought settled in the minds of everyone present. This wasn't the end. This was only the beginning. Because what happened next, no one could have predicted. Now, I need to know, what do you think Vlad was feeling in that moment? If you've ever had an animal show you loyalty like this, tell me in the comments. Type the word hope if you believe that love never truly fades no matter how much time passes. And hold on, because what's coming next will leave you speechless. The carrier door clicked shut with a quiet finality, but there was no sudden panic, no desperate attempt to escape. Vlad remained still, curled against the soft fabric that smelled of the only person who had ever truly cared for him. His small body trembled, not from fear, but from something deeper, an uncertainty he had never known before. He had spent days, maybe even weeks, holding on to a world that no longer existed, waiting for something, for someone who would never return. And now, in the dead of night, surrounded by strangers who had been nothing more than distant figures in the background of his grief, he had made a choice. Not to let go, never that, but to move, to trust, to take that first fragile step into a world beyond the grave he had refused to leave. The rescuers didn't speak. No words were necessary. They moved with quiet precision, lifting the carrier carefully, making sure the motion was smooth, steady. The last thing they wanted was to break whatever delicate understanding had settled between them and the grieving pup. Vlad remained pressed into the corner, his dark eyes wide, watching, absorbing. He wasn't fighting, but he wasn't entirely at ease either. He was processing. The weight of everything, the loss, the loneliness, the unfamiliarity of what came next, pressed into his tiny frame, heavy and suffocating. The village woman who had brought the scarf walked beside them, her face lined with something between sadness and relief. She had seen him suffer, had watched him refuse food, companionship, warmth. And yet, tonight, something had shifted. He had chosen not to stay behind. She wasn't sure if that was a sign of healing or simply exhaustion, but either way, it meant hope. And hope was enough. The road leading away from the cemetery was uneven, lined with old stones and gnarled roots that twisted out from the earth like ancient fingers. The wind had settled into a slow, whispering hush, rustling through the branches above, almost as if the trees themselves were watching, waiting, bearing witness to something sacred. The headlights from the rescue vehicle cut through the darkness, a sharp contrast to the endless shadows stretching in every direction. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Vlad was leaving the only place he had ever felt safe. The journey back was silent except for the soft hum of the engine, the occasional bump in the road causing the carrier to shift slightly. Each time it moved, Vlad's ears twitched, his grip tightening on the fabric, his breathing slow but steady. He didn't whimper. He didn't cry. He simply held on, as if the thin piece of cloth in his jaws was the last remaining thread connecting him to the life he had lost. One of the rescuers, sitting beside the carrier, resisted the urge to reach out, to offer comfort in the way humans instinctively do, with touch, with reassurance. But this wasn't about human comfort. This was about Vlad, about what he needed, what he was ready for. And right now he needed space. Time. A moment to understand that he was not being taken from something, but led toward something else. Outside, the village lights flickered in the distance, small beacons of warmth against the cold expanse of night. The rescue center wasn't far now, just beyond the winding roads that led into the heart of the town. There, waiting beyond the uncertainty, was food, warmth, shelter. But none of those things mattered if Vlad didn't accept them. If he still longed for the graveyard, for the woman who would never call his name again, then all of this would be for nothing. The vehicle slowed as they reached their destination. The rescue shelter was modest, built more for function than comfort. But it was safe. It was a place where lost souls found new beginnings. The headlights illuminated the small fenced-in yard, the soft glow from the windows casting a golden light onto the gravel driveway. A few dogs stirred at the sound of the car, their curious eyes watching from behind the fencing, tails wagging in slow, cautious rhythm. The team moved carefully, lifting the carrier with the same gentleness they had used before. Vlad's eyes darted around, taking in the change of scenery, the unfamiliar scents, the distant barks echoing through the night air. His paws shifted slightly against the plastic floor, but he didn't move, didn't make a sound. He was waiting, watching, trying to decide if this place was friend or foe. Inside, the shelter was quiet, most of the animals already settled for the night. A small space had been prepared for Vlad. Nothing too overwhelming, just a quiet corner, a soft blanket, fresh water, and a bowl of food placed nearby, untouched but waiting. The rescuers set the carrier down gently, leaving the door open. No pressure, no expectation. He had already made one impossible choice tonight. They would not force him into another. For a long moment, nothing happened. Vlad remained where he was, his dark eyes locked onto something invisible, something only he could see. His grip on the fabric loosened slightly, his nose twitching as he took in the scent of the room. He shifted his weight, hesitated, and then, without looking at anyone, took a step forward. It was slow, almost painfully so, but it was movement. He stepped out, his tiny paws pressing into the soft blanket beneath him. He didn't explore, didn't sniff around the way most dogs would. He simply stood there, staring at the floor, the scarf still clutched tightly in his mouth. His breathing was steady but deep, his ears flicking at every distant sound. He was here. Physically at least, but mentally, emotionally, he was still somewhere else. The rescuers didn't speak, didn't move. They let him adjust, let him feel whatever he needed to feel. The clock on the wall ticked softly, the rhythm filling the silence, marking the seconds of this fragile moment. And then, finally, Vlad moved again. He curled into the blanket, still holding the scarf, his body small and fragile against the vast emptiness around him. He was tired, exhausted in a way that went beyond the physical. His grief had drained him, his loyalty had weighed him down for so long. And now, in this quiet space, with no more graves to guard, no more waiting to do, he let his eyes close. It wasn't peace, not yet, but it was rest. And for now, that was enough. But this was only the first night. The real challenge was just beginning. Because what happened next would change everything. Now I want to hear from you. If you were there, watching this moment unfold, what would you have done? Would you have spoken to him, let him be, or tried something else? Comment below with the word healing if you believe that time and love can mend even the most broken hearts. And stay with me because Vlad's journey is far from over. What happens next will leave you speechless. The nights were the hardest. When the world outside the shelter fell silent. When the other dogs curled into their beds. When the lights dimmed and the soft hum of the night settled over everything. That was when the weight of loss crept back in. That was when Vlad would retreat into himself, curling into the smallest space possible, his tiny frame tucked so tightly around the faded scarf that it was hard to tell where he ended. And it began. He didn't whimper. He didn't cry. He just held on, breathing in what little remained of the only love he had ever known. The rescuers watched over him, taking shifts to ensure he wasn't left alone for too long. They spoke to him in gentle voices, never forcing interaction, just letting him know they were there. They placed fresh food near him, though he barely touched it. They set soft blankets in his space, though he only lay on the one that smelled of her. He wasn't aggressive. He wasn't frightened. He was just grieving. And grief doesn't have a timeline. It doesn't fade just because the setting has changed. The other dogs in the shelter seemed to understand in a way only animals can. They didn't crowd him, didn't bark at him, or try to force play. They gave him space, treating him as if they knew he was carrying something too heavy for his small body to bear. They passed by his corner without lingering, sensing that, for now, he needed to be unseen, untouched. Days passed like this. He would eat just enough to keep going, but never with enthusiasm. He would walk when necessary, but always return to his corner, to his scarf, to the small, safe world he had built for himself. The rescuers worried. They had seen dogs take time to adjust before. But Vlad's sadness was something different. It wasn't just fear of a new place or hesitation around humans. It was something deeper, something raw. But then something shifted. It was small at first, barely noticeable. A change in his breathing, a moment where his ears perked just slightly at the sound of footsteps rather than flattening in disinterest. A hesitation before curling up, as if debating whether to stay in his usual position or maybe try something new. The change wasn't dramatic, it wasn't immediate, but it was happening. One evening, as one of the rescuers sat nearby, pretending not to watch him, Vlad lifted his head. His eyes, still deep and unreadable, flickered with something almost imperceptible. He didn't move, didn't make a sound, but for the first time since he had arrived, he wasn't looking through them. He was looking at them. A moment of recognition, a flicker of awareness, a crack in the wall he had built around himself. Encouraged, they started trying something new. They left small toys near his space, not pushing them toward him, just letting them sit there, available if he ever decided to reach for them. At first, he ignored them completely. They were foreign objects, meaningless distractions. But one day, a small ball rolled just slightly when another dog passed by, bumping it into the edge of his blanket. It was unintentional, a random moment, but it changed everything. Vlad's eyes followed the movement, not with excitement, not with playfulness, just curiosity, a small instinctive reaction that he didn't even seem to understand himself. His nose twitched, his paws flexed against the fabric, and for the first time he reached forward, not to push it away but to touch it. It was just a nudge, a tiny, barely there movement, but it was the first thing he had done that wasn't tied to grief. The rescuer watching held their breath, resisting the urge to react, to celebrate, to move too quickly and scare him back into himself. Instead, they simply remained still, allowing the moment to unfold naturally. And then, just as quickly as it had happened, Vlad pulled back, retreating to his scarf, curling around it once more. But something was different. The air around him felt lighter, as if some invisible weight had been lifted just slightly. The moment passed, but it left something behind. Possibility. From that day on, the change continued, slow but steady. He still mourned. That would never disappear overnight. But the small things started to shift. His eating improved, not much, but enough that it no longer felt like a battle. He started watching the other dogs more closely, no longer existing in his own world, but taking in the one around him. He still kept to himself, still returned to his scarf every night, but his body was no longer curled so tightly, no longer braced against some unseen force. And then came the moment no one expected. It happened in the late afternoon, when the shelter was quiet, when the sun cast golden light through the windows, stretching long beams across the floor. A young, energetic pup had been playing near Vlad's space, rolling a small plush toy between its paws, tossing it in the air, catching it again. It wasn't bothering Vlad, wasn't trying to include him, just existing in its own little world. And then the toy slipped. It rolled across the floor, coming to a slow stop just inches from Vlad's paws. Silence fell. The younger pup froze, waiting to see what would happen. The rescuer, who had been nearby watching as always, felt their breath catch. Vlad stared at the toy, his eyes flickered, his ears twitching. For a long moment, nothing happened. And then, he moved. It was slow, hesitant, but deliberate. He stretched out one paw, pressing against the soft fabric of the toy. It gave under the pressure, bouncing just slightly. Vlad pulled back as if startled by his own action. He looked around, as if making sure no one had noticed. But then, after a pause, he reached out again. This time, he didn't pull back immediately. This time, he let his paw rest against it. And then, he nudged it. Not far, just a few inches. But it was enough. The younger pup, sensing the shift, let out a small, excited bark, jumping forward and nudging the toy back toward him. Vlad stiffened but didn't run. He watched it roll, watched it settle back into place. His tail, which had been motionless for so long, gave the smallest, barely perceptible twitch. A second passed, then another, and then, for the first time since he had arrived at the shelter, for the first time since he had lost the only person he had ever loved, Vlad did something no one expected. He pushed the toy back. It was clumsy, hesitant, unsure. But it was play. It was trust. It was healing. The rescuer wiped at their eyes, pretending it was just dust. The younger pup let out another happy bark, wagging its tail in excitement. And Vlad didn't run. He didn't retreat. He simply sat there, blinking as if realizing something he hadn't before. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't alone anymore. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever witnessed an animal slowly open their heart again after loss? What do you think was going through Vlad's mind in that moment? If this story is touching you, comment breakthrough below so I know you're following along. And stay with me, because what happens next will leave you speechless. The days at the shelter passed slowly, but something had changed. Vlad was no longer just existing. He was watching, listening, responding in small but powerful ways. The tentative nudge of a toy had turned into something more, a moment of curiosity, a flicker of trust, a quiet acknowledgement that life still moved forward. He wasn't playing all the time, wasn't suddenly carefree, but the change was undeniable. The weight he had been carrying, the invisible burden of grief that had kept him anchored to the past, was slowly beginning to shift. He started to eat more regularly, not just out of necessity but because he wanted to. His movements became less hesitant, his body less curled into itself. At night, he still tucked himself around the scarf, still held on to that last remaining piece of his past. But now, when the morning came, he would rise to greet the day instead of simply enduring it. He began sniffing at the air when the other dogs were let out into the yard, his ears perking at the sound of laughter, of running paws against the dirt. And then, one morning, he did something no one expected. The staff had opened the door to the yard like they always did, letting the dogs stretch their legs, run, play. Vlad had been watching from his usual spot, curled near his blanket, the scarf still tucked beneath his paw. He had never shown interest in stepping outside. The open space was too much, too uncertain, too different from the small, quiet world he had created for himself. But this time, as the other dogs rushed out, tails wagging, he hesitated. He lifted his head, watching, his nose twitching as the scent of fresh air drifted in. His paws shifted, his body tensed. And then, before anyone could react, he stood up. For a second, he just stood there, staring at the open door. The sun cast long streaks of gold across the floor, the world beyond stretching wide and endless. His tail twitched, his ears flicked back. And then, as if pulled by something unseen, he took a step forward. The shelter workers froze, holding their breath, afraid that any movement might startle him back into his corner. But Vlad wasn't looking at them. His eyes were fixed on the open doorway, on the soft grass beyond it, on something none of them could see. And then he took another step, and another. He crossed the threshold on his own. The sunlight hit his fur, making it glow with warmth. The scent of earth, of fresh grass, of something new and alive filled his lungs. He blinked against the brightness, his head tilting slightly as he took it all in. The other dogs barely noticed him at first, too caught up in their own excitement. But one, a quiet, gentle retriever mix, paused. It watched him, ears perked, tail wagging slowly, then trotted forward, stopping a few feet away, not too close, just waiting. Vlad didn't run. He didn't flinch. He simply stood there, breathing. The moment stretched, silent and fragile. And then, he moved, slowly at first, cautiously stepping forward, his paws pressing into the soft dirt. The retriever wagged its tail again, then turned, trotting off across the yard. And Vlad followed. It wasn't running, not yet. But it was movement. It was choice. It was the first real sign that he was ready, not to forget but to move forward. The days that followed were filled with more of these moments. He explored the yard a little more each time, never straying too far, but going just far enough. He interacted with the other dogs, not playfully, not yet, but with quiet curiosity. He let the rescuers get closer without retreating. He accepted gentle touches without stiffening. And then came the day that would change everything. A family arrived at the shelter, a quiet, kind couple who had seen Vlad's story and felt something stir inside them. They weren't looking for just any dog. They were looking for him. They didn't expect a playful, excitable pup. They knew his past, his loss, his grief, and they didn't want to replace what he had lost. They wanted to give him something new. The introduction was slow. They sat with him, not reaching out, just existing in the same space, letting him decide if he wanted to come closer. And to everyone's quiet astonishment, he did. He moved toward them, sniffing at their hands, his body cautious but open. They didn't rush him. They simply let him be. And then, after a long pause, he did something that no one had seen him do before. He leaned into them, just slightly, just enough. It was decided. The adoption process was smooth, but when the day came for him to leave the shelter, there was a quiet tension in the air. Would he hesitate? Would he refuse? Would he pull back into himself at the last moment? The carrier was unnecessary. He didn't need it anymore. Instead, they fastened a soft collar around his neck, attached a leash, and led him toward the car. He hesitated at the door, looking back just once. The shelter workers watched, their hearts in their throats, waiting to see what he would do. And then, with one deep breath, he jumped inside. His new home was quiet, warm, safe. There was a soft bed waiting for him, though he chose, on that first night, to sleep curled on a blanket with his scarf tucked beneath his chin. But he wasn't curled up tightly anymore. His body was looser, his breathing steady. He still carried the past with him. He always would. But now, he had something else. A future. Weeks passed, and his progress continued. He learned the sounds of his new home, the feeling of familiar hands, the gentle routine of love given without expectation. He started to greet his family when they walked through the door, started to wag his tail ever so slightly when he was spoken to. And then, one day, in the open fields behind the house, something incredible happened. He ran, not out of fear, not out of desperation, but because he wanted to. His paws hit the ground in a rhythm that felt like freedom, his ears flapping in the wind, his body moving with a lightness that had never been there before. He was free. He had found a new home, but he had never forgotten his old friend. Because love, the kind that changes you, the kind that lingers long after someone is gone, never truly fades. It stays, it shapes you, and it carries you forward, step by step, into whatever comes next. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever seen an animal overcome grief in a way that left you speechless? Do you believe that love stays with them, even after loss? Comment forever love if you believe that the bond between animals and their humans never truly breaks. And don't go anywhere, because there's one more part of this journey that you need to see. There are stories that touch us, and then there are stories that change the way we see the world. Vlad's journey was not just about rescue. It was not just about survival. It was about something deeper, something that often goes unnoticed but has always been there. An unspoken truth about the way animals feel, the way they love, and, perhaps most painfully, the way they grieve. For so long, humans have told themselves that animals move on quickly, that they live in the moment, that they don't dwell on loss the way we do. But Vlad's story, and the stories of so many others like him, prove otherwise. They don't just love us in the way we assume. They hold on to us. They remember. They wait. And when we're gone, they mourn. Think of Hachiko, the Akita who waited at a train station every day for his owner to return, long after he had passed. Think of Capitan, the dog who slept beside his owner's grave for years, refusing to leave his side even in death. These aren't just isolated moments. These are glimpses into a truth we often try to ignore. Dogs don't just rely on us. They don't just need us. They choose us. And when we leave, that choice doesn't disappear. Vlad had a choice. He could have moved on, found food elsewhere, sought out shelter anywhere but that cold cemetery. But he didn't. He stayed because that was where he had last felt love. That was where she had been. And no matter how much time passed, he wasn't ready to leave her behind. Because to him, leaving wasn't just about distance. It was about losing the last tangible connection to the only home he had ever known. How many animals out there are still waiting? How many are curled up in places no one notices? In doorways, on sidewalks, in empty lots, because they still believe their person is coming back? How many wag their tails at the sound of footsteps, only for hope to turn to heartbreak when they realize it's not who they were expecting? We talk about the loyalty of dogs like it's something simple, something lighthearted. But their devotion is not just endearing, it is profound. It is painful. It is love in its purest, most selfless form. And it's not just dogs. Cats, often thought to be indifferent, have been known to linger in the favorite spots of those they've lost, rubbing against clothes that still carry a familiar scent, staring at doors that will never open again. Even wild animals, creatures who are supposed to follow nothing but instinct, have been documented exhibiting signs of mourning. Elephants who touch the bones of their lost herd members, dolphins who carry the bodies of their deceased calves, birds who refuse to leave the side of a fallen mate. Love, grief, loss. These emotions are not exclusive to humans. They never have been. But what makes dogs different, what makes their pain hit so much closer to home, is that their entire world revolves around us. We are not just a passing presence in their lives. We are everything. We are their family, their security, their purpose. And when that is taken away, they don't just move on. They search. They wait. They hold on to the only thing they have left. Memories, scents, places. Vlad's story is a reminder that the bonds we form with animals do not vanish the moment we walk away. That their love is not conditional, not fleeting, not something that disappears with time. It stays. It lingers in the spaces we once shared, in the small habits they refuse to let go of, in the way they look at the world, still expecting us to return. And that's why rescue isn't just about food, or shelter, or safety. It's about healing. It's about showing them that love doesn't have to end with loss. That there is more waiting for them beyond the pain. That moving forward does not mean forgetting. Vlad may have left that cemetery, but he never left behind the love that brought him there. It lives on in him, in every wag of his tail, in every moment of trust he allows himself to feel again. And if there's one thing his story teaches us, it's this: dogs don't just love, they remember, they grieve, and when given the chance, they heal. Now, I want to hear from you. Have you ever witnessed an animal hold on to a bond long after it was gone? Do you believe that love, real, deep, unbreakable love, stays with them just as it stays with us? If this story has touched your heart, comment "Loyalty never dies" below. And don't go anywhere, because the next part of this journey is one you won't want to miss. If this story moved you, if Vlad's journey made you see the love and loyalty of animals in a whole new way, don't let it end here. There are so many other stories that deserve to be told, so many animals still waiting for their chance at a second life. And you can be part of that. Hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss another story like this. Every new video brings another powerful rescue, another moment of hope, another reminder of the incredible connection between humans and animals. You won't want to miss what's coming next, and trust me, the next story will leave you speechless. If you made it to the end, I want to know, what did this story mean to you? Comment "loyal hearts" below to let me know you're here, that you felt this, that you believe in the love and devotion of animals just like Vlad. And before you go, don't forget to leave a like. It helps more people see this story, helps more people understand just how much these animals feel. And now, before you click away, watch the next video appearing on your screen. If you thought Vlad's story was unforgettable, just wait until you see what happens next. Another rescue, another life hanging in the balance, Another moment that will change everything. Click now and be part of it.